So we're discussing the fallout from, in other words, we have the basic case, and with the basic case we discussed last week and 2 weeks ago, but now we have multiple cases that sort of stem from the original case, and some are similar and some are dissimilar, and some of the laws are the same and some of the laws are different. So it just gets interesting. I personally like this chapter. It's a little complicated, but I think we can go through it together and work it out. The basic case is what we discussed last week and 2 weeks ago. And the basic case is that in the event where we have two groups of witnesses that contradict each other, what do? So we said in the event that two groups of witnesses contradict each other, you send them both home. That created all sorts of problems last week and the week before. But let's try to put that aside for a moment. Let's assume that we cannot confirm which one is saying the truth, which one is lying. We don't know what to do. We have to send them both home. Okay, that was the scenario, and then that was the scenario. Sort of we discussed that for multiple weeks because we discussed the difference between cases where you believe the second witness, the second group of witnesses, where they say that the first group of witnesses are lying because not that they contradict the underlying event, but they say that the group A was not present. They were elsewhere. And that's what they call conspiring witnesses. And the law is about conspiring witnesses. The Torah tells us that we believe the second group, not the first group. But then the cases where they're both disputing the facts, they're not talking about where the witnesses were, but both group A and group B both dispute the facts. They both say we were at a certain time, at a certain place, at a certain event, and either the event happened or it didn't happen. That's called two groups of witnesses, hamakchishot zu et zu, which means they contradict each other. In that case, we say we send them both home. Okay. So that was 2 weeks ago and before that. Last week, we started another fascinating discussion, which is what do you do? What happens to their credibility regarding other cases, right? So in this, regarding the case in dispute, we send them both home and we don't know who to follow. So we follow nobody. The question becomes, do we assume that this entire group, all four witnesses, in other words, do we assume that both witnesses not here are both groups of witnesses are not able to testify about other matters? And we mentioned that it was a Talmudic dispute where one opinion says you have 50% chance that one of these groups lied. In other words, one of these groups lied. We're just not sure who lied. So therefore we have to disqualify both of them. That's one Talmudic opinion. But the other Talmudic opinion, and that's the opinion that the law follows and Maimonides quotes, is that if each one comes separately, each group comes separately, then you're allowed to look at each group as an individual and say, group A, I don't know for sure that they're lying. So if they come about an unrelated matter, I'm allowed to accept group A. Group B shows up about an unrelated matter, I'm allowed to accept group B because I don't know that they're lying. So in other words, the takeaway from that case is if each group comes alone, you're allowed to look at each group individually, and then you can give each one credibility. What is the interesting scenario? The interesting scenario we mentioned last week, if they both come together. What is the case where they both come together? For example, if one person from group A and one person from group B combine to make to testify about an unrelated matter, here we have no choice. We must disqualify this group because we know this group is comprised of at least one witness who is not saying the truth. So in other words, if they come together, we have no choice but to disqualify them. If they come separate, like we mentioned, there's a Talmudic dispute, but the opinion of Maimonides and the opinion of the law, I think most decisors agree with Maimonides. Would be that each one you can look at each one individually, and that's the case we read last week. And this going to branch out into many subcases in this week, and it gets a little detailed. but I think it's interesting, and you may enjoy the ride, you may enjoy the journey. So I'm looking forward to it. In the meantime, before we even start, because it's all built on what we said in the past, if anybody who has any comment or question on what we said so far, please share, because everything that we're going to say is going to be built on this. So I want to make sure that we at least, you don't have to agree with everything I said or Maimonides said or the Talmud said, but I will at least want to make sure that you understand or see the logic. You don't have to agree, but you have to see the logic. And if you're silent, that means I think you agree. So you better be careful, because silence is dangerous here. In this group, if you're silent, then I think you agree. So if you have any objection, now is the time to voice it. Go ahead.
Rabbi, last week, I didn't quite understand why Maimonides coded in favor of believing if one group comes separately. But after you brought the example of impurity, purity and purity, that helped me to kind of understand better, because if you keep disqualifying everybody, we soon gonna run out of witnesses. The same with purity and purity. If you keep saying that everybody's impure, you won't be able to perform service in the temple, right?
You'll be left with nobody. So you're saying a practical concern. So you know what? That helps me. I'm going to give one more explanation of why we do this before we get to the details, because this is a big picture idea. So I'm going to give one more interpretation. And this is the interpretation that I'm going to give now is actually written. It's written in Rashi. So the commentaries say this interpretation. So you've been here long enough to know that there is a Talmudic principle called chazaka. Chazaka means that there is a legal assumption. And according to Judaism, according to halacha, according to the Talmudic law, there is a tremendous amount that is determined based on legal assumption. And it applies in many areas of the law, many areas of the law. For example, okay, I am Menachem Feldman. How do you know I'm Menachem Feldman? In other words, if there's a document that says Menachem Feldman owes Vicky Markova $1 million, so we come to court. So Vicky says, you owe me $1 million. I say, look, I hate to break the news to you, but I'm not Menachem Feldman. Go bring witnesses that were at my circumcision and who were there and heard my parents give me the name, right? So that doesn't fly. Why doesn't it fly? Because there's a chazaka, there's an assumption, a legal assumption. And the legal assumption is if people heard you using this name for 30 days, we assume it's your name. You don't have to prove. But then it becomes even more complicated. For example, I'm not allowed to marry a person is not allowed to marry. Okay, a person is not allowed to marry a relative. Okay? So what happens if I walk into court, I want to marry a close relative? They say, you can't. She's your relative. I say, what? You don't know she's my relative. They say, you grew up in the same house. I said, no, they adopted me, right? So the point of the matter is that the legal assumption is if everybody assumed that you are relatives, you become relatives. Actually, relatives, I'm not 100% sure. I think you need one witness to establish relatives. So forget about the relative case. Delete what I just said. If we assume somebody is married, and then she shows up in court and says, I want to marry. They say, you're already married. She says, no, I'm not. So if the assumption is if everyone knows her to be married, she's considered married. And there are a lot of laws in this area called chazaka, called legal assumption. Now, I'm going to give another example for a legal assumption in other areas. For example, we know, and it's also true in American law, and that is the power of possession. If you have a movable object, so in America they say that possession is 9/10 of the law. So if I have a wristwatch, I don't have my wristwatch, but if I have a wristwatch, I have a Rolodex, I have an expensive wristwatch, and you show up and you say, hey, the wristwatch belongs to you, and I say, what do you mean it belongs to me? So what's the law? Because I'm in possession of the wristwatch, we say that's a chazaka. There's a legal assumption that it's mine. And if you want to extract something that is in my possession, the burden of proof is upon you. That's another form of chazaka. That's movable objects. We also discussed in the past, years ago, we spent a few weeks on the tractate Bava Batra, the chapter about the real estate. And over there we had the Talmudic principle that if you're living in a house for 3 years, you get a chazakah, and we have an assumption that the house belongs to you, even if you can't prove it. Again, it's subject to details, but that's the big picture. So chazakah, legal assumption, is very powerful. And so how do we apply the concept of chazakah? So here, let's think about it this way. There's 2 ways to look at the scenario. In other words, we have a scenario where Group A and Group B contradicted each other last week. This week, Group A shows up and testifies that Menachem Feldman owes Vicky $100. What do? We don't know. Could we trust this group or not? So when we're not sure what to do, we fall back on the concept of chazakah, legal presumption. But now the question is, what legal presumption are you going to fall back on? So one perspective is that you fall back on the legal presumption that the money is in the possession of its owner, right? So hamotzi mechaverei olav araya, which is Aramaic for if you want to extract money from your friend, the burden of proof is upon you. So Group A shows up and they want to take $100 from my wallet and give it to Vicky. So we say, look, the burden of proof is upon you, upon Group A, upon the person who wants to extract money from Menachem Feldman. If you want to extract money, the burden of proof is upon you. So we have to be absolutely certain that you met your bar of burden of proof. And Group A, we're not absolutely certain that Group A is trustworthy. And because we're not absolutely certain that Group A is trustworthy, what do we do with the $100? We leave the $100 in the possession of the previous owner, which is Menachem Feldman. That's one perspective. That would be the perspective that we should not accept Group A when they come about an unrelated matter. But then there's another perspective, and that's the perspective that the Maimonides follows. And it's possible, Vicky, that this is why we like this opinion. Because in addition to the presumption of the money, there's another chazakah here. What's your other chazakah? What's your other legal presumption? The other legal presumption is that unless proven otherwise, a person has the chazakah of being kosher. Kosher means fit, trustworthy. So now, if you don't look at the money that's in my wallet, but you want to look at Group A, so there's a legal principle that unless you know for a fact otherwise, a person or two people or a group of people have a presumption of their upstanding citizens, unless you can prove otherwise. If that's the case, if that's the way you're going to apply the principle.
In other words, you're innocent until proven guilty, or you're trustworthy until proven otherwise. It's more like of that.
Right. You're certainly innocent until proven guilty. That's for sure. You're certainly innocent plus proven guilty. But the question is, could we trust you as a witness? Are you trustworthy? Until proven otherwise? And the answer is yes, you are trustworthy until you're proven otherwise. But over here, there's a clash because we have 2 chazakas. If you look at the money, then you say the money has to be placed in the possessor, in my case, in Menachem Feldman's wallet, until you know for a fact, 100% sure, or whatever the burden is, until the burden is met, that I have to pay it to you. And if that's the case, if you're looking at the money, then I could say Group A, we're not 100% sure if they're saying the truth, and you want to extract money from Group A. So I'm going to say we're not extracting money from the person, from the chazakah. The money belongs where it belongs. The money belongs in its possession unless you're certain otherwise. Could you be certain otherwise? No. That's if you apply the chazakah to the money. If you apply the chazakah to the people, then you could say, look, Group A has the chazakah, legal presumption. We don't have to prove because we have a presumption. That's the beauty of a presumption. The beauty of a presumption is that you don't have to prove it. If you had to prove that Group A is saying the truth, that would be a little problematic. You won't be able to do that. But if you're following the presumption, you don't have to prove. So if you apply the concept of presumption and say that Group B, and say that Group A has a presumption of saying the truth, then you can trust Group A when it comes to an unrelated matter. In other words, both the opinions in the Talmud, both the opinion that says we don't trust group A in an unrelated matter. I believe that's Rav Huna. And then the opinion that says you do trust group A in an unrelated matter. I believe that's Rav Chisda. Both those people follow the concept of chazakah. There's a legal presumption. The question is, how do they apply that principle? The person who says you don't follow group, you don't accept group A in an unrelated matter, they say group A is not powerful enough to undo a presumption of ownership. And money is in the presumption of its possessor. And if you want to extract money from the possessor, you need to have absolute certainty. And group A is not enough to produce that absolute certainty. That's how they apply the chazakah. Then you have the other way of applying the chazakah and saying, don't apply the chazakah, the legal presumption to the money, apply the legal presumption to the person. Group A is saying the truth unless you're absolutely certain that they're not saying the truth. Oh, so then we're not absolutely certain that group A lied, and therefore group A could be believed. That's what the Talmud says and Rashi said. Now, my answer to Vicky's question is, why do we follow the law that we do believe group A in a different matter? In other words, if we have a choice to use the chazakah, to apply it to money, or to apply it to give people presumption of trustworthiness, we'd rather use this legal principle to give legal presumption to trustworthiness of people. In other words, we'd rather use the legal mechanism to say that people are trustworthy than to keep the money in the wallet of the possessor. So that end, I'm putting that in. I don't know if that's true, but certainly the disagreement is of how you apply the concept of chazakah. That is accurate, at least according to Rashi. So that is something that about this law today. So at least it adds something. Again, this is going to be the bedrock of the discussion. So we can't go further until you sign that you agree. No, I'm kidding. You don't have to sign you agree, but you do have to say, I understand the logic. You don't have to agree with the logic, but you have to say that you see the logic. And once we get back by the foundation, we can start going toward the details and the building and branching out. So
Good
that's
morning,
the story
Rabbi.
in short. If anybody wants to make a comment, go ahead. Good morning.
Do you hear me? This is Steve.
Steve, it's so good to hear you. I haven't heard you in 6 months.
It's been at least that long. Now, in Pirkei Avot, don't we? Isn't there one rabbi who says that a judge should assume guilt?
Yes, the judge should assume guilt. That's an excellent point. It says the judge should assume both parties are guilty. In other words, if you have two litigants that come before you, says the court, don't look at them and say, this guy looks trustworthiness. I'm going to trust what he tells me. The directive to the judge is be critical. Don't be critical of one party. Be critical not of one litigant. Be critical of both litigants. And that's just a way of the Torah telling you is that when you are a judge, your job is to question, and your job is to don't take anything based on what they said. In other words, you have to use your own mind. Don't say, well, I think I trust this person. So that's for that. How does this apply to our case? So I think it's a little bit different because there's a difference between there. We're talking about the litigants. The Mishnah says that when the two litigants, Baalei Hadin, when the litigants stand before you, view them as both, not one. View them as both are rishaim, are wicked. In other words, don't trust everything the litigant tells you. But with witnesses, it's a little bit different. Witnesses are not involved parties. They're showing up. You can question them and you can be critical, but the underlying basis of the assumption has to be that unless you prove otherwise, people have a sense of people are trustworthy. Otherwise, how do you accept witnesses at all? Because you're going to have to first establish that they're saying the truth. So that's an excellent question because it's a little bit different. One is sort of an attitude, and one is a legal status. I would argue that the legal status of the people before you are that they that's the legal status. But the attitude of the judge has to be critical. And the way the ethics of the fathers tells you, the language it uses to say that you have to be critical, it says, view them kirishayim, as if they were wicked. As if means they're not wicked. But if you're the judge and you have to scrutinize, then you should view them as wicked, be critical as if they were wicked, but in reality, they're not wicked. And therefore, unless you can prove otherwise, you have to assume that people are saying the truth. And again, it's also different because with the litigants, you know for sure there's a conflict because two people are disagreeing. With the witnesses, you know, there's no one opposing them right now. If someone is opposing them, two groups of witnesses contradict each other, then you're right. Then there's no chazakah. Then you send them both home. But if you have one group of witnesses show up, the presumption is that they're saying the truth. You could be critical. You could treat them as if they were wicked, but in reality, they have to have the chazakah that they are innocent, that they are trustworthy, unless you know otherwise. So that's the principle of the chazakah, and that's how you apply it according to this opinion in the Talmud, and that happens to be the opinion that Maimonides follows. But that's an excellent question. Thank you, Steve.
Everything's frozen. You still
No,
there?
I'm not. No, I think I'm still here, unless you don't do. I'm just thinking.
Oh, okay. It looked like you were frozen for a moment.
You have to give me the presumption of innocence.
But I don't have a witness.
Okay.
I'm a witness.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, Richard.
Good to hear you.
Yeah, I have no excuse for not joining you earlier.
Well, we're not looking for an excuse. As long as you're here, we're happy. The rabbi's happy, and he's coming out of his freeze right now. So I think he's going to say something. No, he's still frozen.
Okay, here we go. Case number 2. So that was section number 1. Should we read it inside? We read it inside last week. We don't have to read it again. We're up to chapter 22, Edut, the laws of testimony, chapter 22, verse section 2. Okay, here is an interesting case, which is a spin-off of the original case. So, Vicky, if you don't mind, I'm going to use your name. Vicky pulls out 2 documents. One document says, on this and this day, Menachem borrowed $100. The other document says, on this and this day, Menachem borrowed $200. So she has 2 documents. You would assume that if she can authenticate her documents, you would assume that then she would be able to collect $300 from me. Why $300? Because she has one document that says 200 and one document that says 100. So far, everything is smooth. The problem for Vicky is that is as follows. One document is signed by Group A, and one document is signed by Group B. Okay, so let's just give you the case. You have Group A and Group B disagreed, contradict each other. The law is we send them both home. The law is also that we believe that if they both come together, Group A and Group B show up together, they're not believed, because if the court has to examine the entire Group A and Group B together, they have to send them both. They have to send them both home. But if they come independently, then the court is allowed to look at each one independently and give Vicky and consider each one to be a good witness. So here's the scenario: we pull up into court. Vicky pulls out 2 documents. one signed by group A, one signed by group B. One document says I owe her $100, and the other document says I owe her $200. So based on what we know till now, how would you rule in this case? It seems like group A and group B are coming to court together. Now, even though they're not coming to court together because they're not coming to court at all, but their signatures are being presented in court together. So now the question is, what do I do in this case?
But this is on unrelated documents,
It's an unrelated document, but they came together in some sense. If you're the judge, not you, someone else is the judge, and the judge sees one document that's presented before the judge with group A, the other document is presented before the judge group B, the judge knows the Talmud says you cannot trust group A and group B, somebody's lying here, I can't award Vicky $300 because group A and group B are here sitting here together before me. So therefore, so what do?
The documents unrelated, you can believe them. But I have another question for you. Because you use my name.
Go ahead.
Could women testify in court back then?
I'm sorry?
Could women testify in court?
Well, that's a complicated question. The dry letter of the law in the Talmud is no. That's the dry letter of the law. But in reality, in practice, the answer is in many cases yes. So it's a complicated discussion. In other words, the dry letter of the law says no. It says to be a testimony, you have to be a man, you have to be 13, you have to be obligated to the commandments. Women do not qualify according to the dry Talmudic law. But like I said, there's so many exceptions that in practice the answer is that almost always the answer is probably yes. So that's for that discussion. Maybe we'll have that discussion another time because it's interesting.
But in any case, I would vote for believing because the documents are unrelated, could be signed at different times.
They're signed at different times. I'm going to push back, Vicky, if you don't mind. I'm going to sign at different times. Do we agree? Okay, let's go back. Do we agree that if Group A and Group B happen to show up in court in person, and each testify about an unrelated case, but they come together, do we agree that the court has no choice but not to believe them? Let me go back to the case that you liked about the purity. If you remember last week, we also gave a case about the purity. Remember, we had two streets. One street has a corpse on it, and therefore one street is ritually impure. The other street was ritually pure. Two people crossed both streets, but they're not sure who crossed when, which person crossed one street. So we know that one of them are impure, but we know that one of them are impure, but we don't know which one. So the law was that if they both come to the court, if each one comes independently to inquire about his status, each one would say, we don't know that you're impure, and therefore you are pure. But we said if they both come together, we have no choice but to say that they're both impure. Apply this to this case, not to the case of monetary law. Group A and Group B both show up in court together the next week. And they're each testifying about unrelated cases. But it doesn't matter because Group A and Group B are before the court together, it's going to be a joke. How could we agree? How could we accept Group A and Group B together if we know for sure that one of them are lying and both of them are in front of us simultaneously? So the trick of looking at each one individually can only be achieved if actually you only have one of them before you. But if you have both of them before you together, then to authenticate both groups of witnesses, it would be a joke. It would look false. It doesn't seem right. So we know that if both groups of witnesses came in person and they would testify about two other cases. So two unrelated cases by Group A and Group B. But because they come before the court together, the law is that we can't accept them. So now the question is, what do I do with these documents?
Can you do two separate sessions, one for one document and
You're
another
smart. If you hire a good lawyer, Vicky, you show up with 2 different days. Day 1, pull out 1 document, and day 2, pull out a second document. We wouldn't have a question. Now, I'm the defendant. I have a mechanism to protect against that. So it gets complicated. We'll get to that. But as we are right now, as far as we're concerned right now, if you did that, you win. You'll get all $300. If you pull out a document day 1 with group A, and then you wait a week and you pull out another document with $200 with group B, you'll get all $300. But let's drop that first. But we're talking about a case where you came before the court, you put down both your documents, you say, Menachem owes me $300, 1 document for $100, another document for $200, 1 is signed by group A, 1 is signed by group B. We have no choice but to throw you out. But what's fascinating about this case is, what does it mean to throw you out? Not that we award you 0, which was what I would think, but we award you 100. Why do we award you 100? Because one of these documents are true. We're not sure which one, but one of them are true. And because one of them are true, so at a minimum, I owe you $100. And therefore, in that case, where I come to the court, where you come to the court and you place both documents on the court together, and you say that Menachem owes you $300, and you have both documents, and in reality, what's happening here is it's the case of Group A and Group B coming to the court together. So based on what we know till now, you would think that reality is we throw them both out. We don't know who to trust. So we can't accept any of them. But here there's a tweak. The tweak of this case is because we know for sure one is true. So we know for sure, even though I don't know which group is saying the truth, but one of them is saying the truth. And one document says 100 and the other document says 200. So we're certain that I owe you at least 100. So even though the letter of the law says you can't believe any of them, but I would owe you $100. That's the second law. That's the case. That's the case in the second clause, the second section of chapter 22.
Is it like the smaller amount?
Yes, it's a smaller amount that we know for sure that regardless of which one is saying the truth, I would owe you $100. Yes, it's a smaller amount, but it's not that we're saying the smaller amount making a compromise. It's that we know that either Group A or Group B are saying the truth. One of those groups are saying the truth and one is lying. But regardless of which one is saying the truth, we know 100 I for sure owe, right? 200, do I owe you 200? I don't know if I owe you 200. That would depend on whether or not whether or not we trust Group A or Group B, and we don't know which one to trust. So you can't make me pay you 200, but you could make you pay 100. Why 100? Because even though I don't know which group of witnesses to trust, but I do know that between the two, regardless of which one I trust, 100 I would definitely owe you. And then if you accept this, if you follow the logic, again, the requirement of joining this call is not that you have to agree with what I'm saying, but the requirement is that if you disagree with the logic, you have to tell me. But I'm just saying, if you see what we're talking about, if you understand the line of logic, then we can proceed. And we proceed and we impose an oath, but I don't want to get into the whole oath business now because that's another whole section. So maybe we'll leave the oath out for right now. But I do want to read, in the words of Maimonides, I want to read the beginning of section 2, and then maybe we'll go to another case, because once we get, we could talk about the oath, but I think we should leave it for now. So let's read number 2. I'll read it. If you want to follow along, good. Otherwise, you can trust me. I'm going to try to be loyal to the English translation, which is not always loyal to the Hebrew, but we'll try. So the names that they use here in the Talmud, the names Maimonides uses Reuven and Shimon. Instead of Vicky and Menachem Feldman, it's Reuven and Shimon. Reuven and Shimon are the first 2 sons of Jacob, the first 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. So we always use their names, the standard names. So there was a joke, I think I said it before, that a guy says, I was in yeshiva for 10 years, and I'm very confused about what they taught me. But one thing I learned, if your name is Reuven, never ever loan any money to Shimon, because every case is Reuven lending money to Shimon, and they get into trouble. So that's just a good thing to know. If your name is Reuven, don't lend any money to Shimon. Okay, so I'm going to read just the beginning of Richard. That was for you.
I was just gonna, I didn't want to interrupt. I said, are you talking to me? Is that me? All right,
That's for you. Okay, so we're looking at section 2. Reuven produced 2 promissory notes against Shimon. So Reuven is the creditor. He produces 2 notes that say that Shimon, let's say I'm Shimon, that I, Shimon, owe you two separate notes. One for a mana. Mana is 100 zuz, and one for 200 zuz. So it's a total of 300 zuz. They call it a mana. A mana is 100 zuz. A zuz is a coin. Those who say Chabad doesn't. Okay, so mana is so we have 2 separate notes, one for 100, one for 200. Shimon denied being obligated for either of the promissory notes. So I'm Shimon. I say I deny it. I don't owe you any money. They say we have witnesses. They say, well, I don't know if I could trust your witnesses. Your witnesses, they have a terrible track record. Group A and Group B, some of them is lying. I don't trust your witnesses. The witnesses to one of the promissory notes were one of the groups whose testimonies contradicted each other, and the witnesses of the other were the second group. So again, you got 2 notes. One note says I owe Reuven. Vicky is Reuven. One note says I owe Reuven $100. The other note says I owe 100 zuz. The other one I say I owe Vicky 200. I owe Shimon 200 zuz. And the witnesses on one is one group of witnesses are Group A, and the other one is Group B. Because remember that there were 2 groups of witnesses that contradicted each other, and each one signed one of these notes. So here's the big idea. The big idea here is, it's not a big idea, it's an application of the other idea, but it is an interesting twist. Because I don't know if I would necessarily, I guess it is logical, I guess. So what do you do then? So Shimon is required to pay only a mana. He has to pay 100. For the bearer of the promissory notes has the position of lesser strength. In other words, Shimon, or in our case, Vicky, you have both documents, your position is lessened. So in other words, we don't know which one is true, so you do the lesser one. Because the lesser one, all agree that regardless of who's saying the truth, Shimon, Reuven, or Shimon, regardless of who's saying the truth, Group A or Group B, 100 zuz is what I would owe you. He must take an oath concerning the remainder. So if you want to get into the oath business, I'm denying this whole thing right out, but I'm being forced to pay 100. So I pay 100, and then I have to take an oath that I don't owe you 200. I don't want to go into the oath because we have 4 minutes left, and that's going to be a whole other discussion. Okay, there's a lot more to talk about, but I think we'll stop here because we have 3 minutes, and not that 3 minutes aren't important, but it's going to take time to dig into the other ones. So I think we'll stop here, and I think it'll be enough for today. And hopefully we'll continue studying either Maimonides or Talmud next Tuesday in good health. And it should be a good day and a good week and a good year. If anybody has any questions or comments, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.